Wandile Sihlobo van Agbiz gesels oor die ekonomiese impak van die voortsleepende oorlog tussen Rusland en Oekraïne op die Suid-Afrikaanse landbousektor. So good morning, Wandile, and thanks again for joining us this morning.
Good morning. Thanks for having me on, Elsa.
Now, I would like to start by asking you, when we take a look at the impact of this war on the South African agriculture sector and also the consumers, what would you point out?
On the South African side, I would say so far we are seeing the negative impact of it through prices. If you think of it on a general South African, we're seeing it through fuel prices, which have risen. But of course, just the rising uncertainty that is out there and various businesses already pricing in the risk. And I think that's what the consumers are seeing this war from perspective. And of course, if you are a producer and you are any food manufacturer or manufacturer indeed of any goods, you are also seeing it so far from the risk of the prices of the inputs that you do need. But I think going forward, if the war continues for longer, and also depending on the disruptions that are happening in the Ukraine, and also Russia being increasingly excluded in the world economy through sanctions and the other things, we yet to see the full impact of it on a number of value chains, particularly as agriculture, on fertilizers, fuel, but also as a consumer through the prices of a number of commodities that we consume, grains being at the top of that list, as well as sunflower oil.
So are we already feeling this impact?
We are indeed, Elsa, already feeling that impact because since the war started, for example, on the 24th of February, we've seen commodity prices rising significantly, particularly the wheat, maize, to an extent rice, sunflower oil, and indeed the entire vegetable cluster because of how important these countries are to the grain market, because combined, we are talking about roughly 30% of global wheat, 30% of global barley exports, and roughly 14% of global maize exports, and indeed nearly 60% of global sunflower oil exports. So if countries producing that much volume of commodities are actually in war and unable to move those commodities out, that means that the impact is instant on the pricing side of those commodities. And as far as the oil prices, you have fuel now roughly at record levels and predicted again to see an over R1 increase in the coming months. So that's the immediate impact that we are seeing through those pricing channels. But I think as consumers have not really felt the full impact that is coming from the food industry, that will probably be lagging by 2 to 3 months until they see it reflected in a number of products, or indeed that they are buying in stores, having filtered the fuel price increase, and indeed the input cost increases that the food manufacturers are feeling.
And I've already referred to, increasing food prices when I read my news bulletin this morning. But how would you describe the concern with regard to food supplies and food security or food insecurity?
I think the concern is in two ways. Firstly is, of course, the one that you had referred to, which is on a pricing side. On prices, given that consumers are already under pressure, not only in South Africa, but really indeed across the African continent and greater part of the world. So the rise in food prices is the one that is going to put households under pressure. And we must appreciate that this arrives at a time where global and indeed South Africa's food prices are generally elevated because of the droughts in South America that have negatively affected the harvest of grains and oilseeds, and to an extent also China, which has been buying for many years large volumes of soybeans, large volumes of some of the vegetable oils, and India alongside that. So those factors were supporting and have kept global food prices at record levels if you were to look at the numbers of February. So the war ended up being an added factor into that, which is why I think on prices we're yet to see the full impact of it and the extent to which many consumers would be under pressure. If you look at East Africa, for example, there are already estimates of over 20 million people that will be in acute poverty And the war is an added risk to those droughts that I've mentioned, but also droughts in East Africa, wars in East Africa, particularly greater part of Ethiopia. So those are the channels that I think many people are feeling. But of course, if you are a producer, we also see a rise in input costs, because Elsa, it's important that we remember that Russia is a leading exporter of fertilizer, making up roughly 14% of global fertilizer exports. So down the line, as the season continues, when farmers have to procure large volumes of the inputs to plant for the upcoming season, that's going to be the issue. And in the near term, people of the Western Cape and Free State and other regions that are planting winter crops are already seeing this in their higher input costs. Similarly to the consumer, this arrives when fertilizer and other input costs were already plus 50% up compared to the previous year. So this just makes the environment that was already tough operating in even much tougher and uncertain.
Mm-hmm. And you know what, Wandile, I mean, you've recently published a very interesting piece regarding some of the exports, you know, with some very interesting percentages as well. But I would just like to get to the cost of production and also distribution.
Absolutely. I mean, when you think about the cost of production, let's take again, for the sake of consistency in our arguments, the grains as one of those. If you think about fertilizer, it makes up roughly 35% of the grain input costs in South Africa. Fuel makes up around about 12 to 13% of the input costs in South Africa. So if you have that, which is roughly 50% of your input costs rising plus 50%, it means that even in a previous season, that's the 2021-22 production season, you were already in tougher conditions. Now, both of those rising at a faster pace, that's going to mean then, the cost of production for farmers would be much higher. And also then, given that significance of Russia into the global fertilizer market, there are worries to say later on in the year, will there be sufficient fertilizers and all of those things? And I think many farmers are worried about that. But at least from Agbiz, what we are able to gather from various agrochemicals and fertilizer companies is that the supply constraints will not be an issue. But what could continue to be an issue and are inescapable at this point is the price. So the decisions that will be made by the farmers as to whether to carry on with the current hectarage of various crops in these high input costs or to reduce, that's going to be important. And of course, the effects thereafter on the supply and later on a consumer. So production costs will remain elevated. And even if you are a food manufacturer, that will remain elevated. And the questions you keep asking yourself is to whether the consumer will have the ability to absorb all of these rising costs.
Mm-hmm. Wandile, you know, maybe you can just give us a little bit of a better perspective in terms of our dependence on imported agricultural inputs.
As a country, Elsa, we heavily dependent on agricultural inputs. I mean, if you think of fertilizer, we are importing roughly 80% of what we are consuming annually. Agrochemicals, we import roughly 98% of what we use annually. So what happens in the global market of these commodities is very important to South Africa, which is why we worry a lot about these geopolitics. And of course, our fuel is also imported.
Mm-hmm. And what is your opinion when it comes to the sanctions?
I mean, there is a diplomatic and a political stunt in as far as that is concerned. And I think what matters a lot is the position of South Africa, the guidance that we get from the leadership of the country as to where they put the sanction. But what's important here is that it matters less what individual organizations are thinking about this issue. But what matters more is what the global community and indeed major players are thinking about this. And Russia having been sanctioned, and the war, of course, is never desired by anyone. We see the cost of human life. We see the disruption in businesses, in livelihoods, and that worries us all onto that. And of course, Russia being punished economically for what it is doing, it does influence everybody else, given the interlinkages that Russia has with the world. But I think all what we wish for at this point is that there is some diplomatic intervention that could be made so that the war could not continue for longer.
What is your overall main concern at this stage?
My overall concern at this stage is rising input costs, as to whether farmers will be able to absorb much of those, and if they don't, what the effects thereafter will be for a consumer. So rising input costs is a major issue that worries us at this point.
And the risk to grains and oilseeds market. I know you've referred to this earlier during our discussion, but is there anything you would like to point out at this stage?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we emphasize a lot on grains and the inputs, but South Africa also exports a large share of its fruits. Roughly 7% of our exports of citrus goes to Russia. 12% of our apples and pears goes to that market. So with them being sanctioned and, of course, excluded to major payment systems such as SWIFT, that does influence the flow of our products. And often the rising shipping costs and insurance for the shipping lines to get to the Black Sea, it's also one of those issues. So it's disrupting our export activity, but also import activity of the input cost and the general input cost. So the issue is in two ways, both on the things that we need in South Africa and also some of those products that we produce in excess and we need to put to the global market.
Mm-hmm. Now, your conclusion refers to the fact that much remains unknown about the coming weeks and even months. So is there anything else, that you would like to end with during our interview this morning?
I would say what I would like to end with is the hope that in the Black Sea there is some diplomatic solutions that could be reached. Everything that is happening, as I said earlier, the loss of human life, if you're watching the images coming out of the Ukraine, as well as the disruption in economies and the impact thereafter in livelihoods across the world. If it's not direct impact by the war, but it's a direct impact through negatively affecting the cost of living across the developing world and indeed the developed world, as the IMF in the article you referred to earlier outlined the negative effects in poor countries. So a quicker solution on this will be good for everyone.
Mm-hmm. Wandile, we've got a couple of seconds left, but maybe a last thought regarding anything in terms of our agricultural sector at this stage.
What I would say quickly for South Africa is that even for consumers, we are not at a crisis where we're running out of products, but what we are seeing is rising costs, which the consumers will be hit with. And of course, they shouldn't think that this is the issue, that farmers are profiting. Farmers are also paying a lot. Whatever they gain as a selling price of their products, they also they're losing it as they procure some of the inputs. So it's a challenging environment in as far as cost of living for all.
Mr. Sihlobo, thank you so much for your insight and also for joining us this morning.
Thank you.
En so gesels Wandile Sihlobo van Agbiz.